Welcome everybody. Super Thursdays here in the Holy Land, Holy Apple, Holy Hilltop. Welcome everybody. This is our contribution for the upcoming holiday of Shavuot. The title of our class today will be "This Shavuot holiday will be different. Here's why." Okay, so let's take it from the top. Mount Sinai, we received the Torah. Did we receive the Torah via free choice, or we were coerced into it? We see that on the 5th day of the month of Sivan, one day before the Torah was given, it is written by our sages that the Jewish people said, "Naseh v'nishma." We will do, and then we'll, check out the details. Whatever it says we're willing to do. Afterwards, we'll start looking into the details. They didn't say let us see the details first. Let us check out the merchandise, and then we'll decide. We're taking the merchandise. Afterwards, we'll figure out how it works. However, the next day, on the 6th day or the 7th day of Sivan, we know that in the Talmud, Tractate Shabbat 88, page 88, it says there that God, so to speak, lifted the mountain, Mount Sinai, over the heads of the Jewish people and said, if you accept the Torah, that is fine. But if not, this will be the place that you will be buried under this mountain. So it seems like the Jewish people were coerced. However, why do you have to coerce somebody if they already agreed? A day or 2 days before that, the Jewish people already had said the famous expression, "Naseh v'nishma," we will do, and then we will check it out. So, anyways, that's a question. Another question is, was this event at Mount Sinai, the coercion, the lifting up the mountain above the heads of the Jewish people, and threatening that if we do not accept the Torah, this will be our last day on earth. The mountain will come down and destroy all of us. Was this a one-time historical event? No. We have in Tractate Sotah, page 34a, we have there another interesting story about coercion. This time, not acceptance of Torah, this time the acceptance of the land of Israel. It was the 10th day of the month of Nisan. The Jewish people had been in the desert for 40 years wandering around, and now it was time finally after 40 years to come into the land of Israel. The Jewish people crossed from east to west. They were on the east side of the Jordan. They crossed over the Jordan River. As they were in the middle of the river crossing over, Joshua had appointed people around every couple of kilometers to announce to those present, all those millions that were coming into the land of Israel, so they would all hear. Jewish people, imagine this, the Jewish people are walking through dry land in the Jordan River, and then God brings the water above their heads. Kind of like take two here. And then God says, via Joshua and his men, they tell the Jewish people the following: if you accept upon yourselves to come into the land of Israel and to expel the nations that reside there and have refused to leave, that is fine. However, if you refuse to expel the inhabitants, the 6 nations that resided in the land of Israel, if you refuse to, then the water will come down and will drown you and kill you all. So this is very interesting here. We have 2 historical events where God pulls out the C card. C card being the coercion card. In Mount Sinai for the Torah, God, so to speak, picks up the mountain of Sinai and put it above the heads of the Jewish people. If you accept the Torah, you live. If not, you die. Same thing when we're entering the land of Israel, in the Jordan River. God lifts up, so to speak, all of the water and places it above the Jewish people's heads and says, if you're willing to expel the inhabitants and live in the land of Israel, that is fine. You will live. You will survive. You will flourish. However, if not, this is your burial place. So we must ask ourselves, is this point, these two historical events, which we see the Jewish people were coerced, is there any hint of this in the Torah writings? Did anybody put the dots together? And of course, obviously, that many did. So we'll give just two mentions of words of our sages. The first one is in the book Shochar Tov. It's in the 68th chapter, the 9th paragraph. Now I warn, it took me a while to find this because for some reason there are many editions of this book which are missing many paragraphs in this chapter. So it took me until I found the whole edition of the Shochar Tov. It took me a while. So don't be discouraged if you say, Yehuda, I looked it up in 68, I didn't find it. Check out different editions and you will find it there. Okay, an amazing piece of information. It says here in Shochar Tov that Rabbi Yossi asks a question. Where in the world did this Mount Sinai come from? You know, there are explorers and historians that have looked the entire world. They're looking for, in Saudi Arabia, all different kinds of places. They're looking for Mount Sinai. Where is Mount Sinai? So this was thousands of years, right? The Torah was given 3,335 years ago. So this has perplexed mankind. So this question was already asked thousands of years ago. Where did this Mount Sinai come from? And the answer is amazing. The Shochar Tov tells us, in the name of Rabbi Yossi, that there was really no Mount Sinai. What does that mean? When God wanted to give the Torah to the Jewish people, just like a woman who is preparing loaves of bread for her family or for herself, in order to enjoy the bread, first she has to take off a portion, separate a portion, which is called challah, the mitzvah for women called challah. And then in the times of the temple was given to the priest. In our days it's burnt. So Rabbi Yossi says, so to speak, God separated the top of Mount Moriah in Jerusalem, where the Temple Mount stood, where Isaac was binded, almost sacrificed by his father Abraham. This place in the center, in the heart of the land of Israel, this was, so to speak, separated like challah, the mitzvah of separating a portion of the dough and giving it to the Kohen, or burning it in our times. And it was set up in the desert and given the name Mount Sinai. So, very interesting that Mount Sinai, where we receive the Torah, is also really Mount Moriah in the land of Israel. So here we see a connection, we see a tremendous connection between Mount Sinai, receiving the Torah, and Mount Moriah, which represents the land of Israel, Jerusalem. So both these events, the Jewish people were coerced. So that's our first hint by our sages. Second hint is based on a verse in Psalms 42:7. It could be found in Yalkut Shimoni 743. In the verse, it talks about King David, talks about his yearning for the Jordan, his yearning for the small mountain. So in this Yalkut Shimoni, they're saying, what in the world was King David talking about? He's yearning for the Jordan. What does that mean? And he's yearning for a small mountain. So in Yalkut Shimoni, they tell us that David was yearning for the Jordan representing the land of Israel, the entrance to the land of Israel. That was the entrance place into the land of Israel. And he was yearning for the small mountain. The small mountain was Mount Sinai, which was a humble mountain compared to the big mama mountains. So, once again, we have here that a verse in Psalms, and also taken by our sages, which King David has the yearning for the land of Israel, represented by the Jordan, where they entered, and the small mountain representing Torah. So these two we see are connected. Okay, take our next step. Step 2. We know there are 613 commandments in the Torah. Why in the world did God decide to pull a coercion on the Jewish people for Torah, receiving Torah, and number 2, receiving the land of Israel? Once again, when the Jewish people came into the land of Israel, into the Jordan River, God via Joshua, actually God via Moses via Joshua, because the message was passed to Moses also, tells them that understand that they're coming into the land of Israel in order to expel and inherit and settle the land. The reason why it wasn't said, we're just coming to settle the land, because in order to settle the land, it's a process. First, the inhabitants have to be expelled. In order to live here and to exist, first you have to eliminate the enemy. So that's why, even though it uses the language of expelling the enemies, we're talking about expelling the enemies, and of course the next stage is settling and building up the land of Israel. So why in the world, of all things, of all commandments that we could coerce, the only 2 that we find in history is Torah and the land of Israel? Is there a connection between the 2? And of course there is. The whole idea of coercion, what does it come to teach us? We explained at the beginning of our class that the Jewish people accepted, volunteered to receive the Torah. Isn't that enough? No. There was a need to coerce. What does coercion mean? Coercion means that something is mandatory. Something is essential. It's compulsory. a person breathing is not subject to one's choice. It's either you breathe, baby, or you die. It's not subject to one's choice. The same level is the Torah and the land of Israel. These are not additions. These are not luxuries. If I accept, if I don't. This is breathing. This is our breath. It's not subject to choice. To understand that the world, the globe, the planet depends on these two cornerstone and foundations of Judaism, Torah and the land of Israel. That is the lesson of the coercion in Mount Sinai for the Torah, and coercion once again to enter the land of Israel. These are two sides of one coin. Torah, one side, and the land of Israel. And this is our breath. This is our lifeline. If you cut it, we're out of here. Not only we're out of here, the world will return to desolation. Our next step in the book Beit Yishai, written by Rav Shlomo Fisher on page 26. The Beit Yishai, he recognizes these two coercions, and he comes up with some beautiful parallels between Torah and the land of Israel. They go hand in hand, connected. So let's roll. Number one, he quotes the Baal HaTurim on the beginning of the portion of Va'era in Exodus. Baal HaTurim points out that twice in the Torah, the word morasha, inheritance, is used. One time in the portion of Va'era in Exodus, the Jewish people are promised the inheritance of the land of Israel, and at the end of the 5th book of Moses, in the portion of Vizot HaBracha, Torah tziva lanu Moshe morasha kihilat Yaakov. God has commanded Moses and given the Jewish people and the sons of Jacob a tremendous inheritance, that being the Torah. So, very interesting. These bosom buddies, the Torah and Eretz Yisrael, both twice in all of the Torah, the word morasha, inheritance. Second similarity. It says in Tractate Brachot, page 5, side A. It says there that three things are acquired, three presents were given to the Jewish people, and they are acquired only through suffering. 1, Torah. 2, the land of Israel. 3, the world to come. Very interesting. In one hand, we have the Torah and the land of Israel, which are tremendous presents. Both are considered to be presents to the Jewish people, even though it says in a different place in the Talmud that God had a tremendous present called Shabbat. I heard from Rav Feiner that it's not a contradiction to this Talmud that says the world to come, because we know that Shabbat is 1/60th of the world to come. It's an example, minute example of the world to come. So it's part of the same package. Number 3 similarity. Rashi brings down twice in the Torah, in the 5 books of Moses, he brings down that when you come into the land of Israel, you have to make sure never to become sick and tired of it. it shouldn't become a habit. You should always be excited about the merit to live in the land of Israel as if you received it today. Rashi, the great commentary of the Torah, he writes the same exact language where we receive the Torah. We are not allowed to become accustomed and become lightheaded about it. We must retain the excitement, the freshness of both these commandments. Torah, as if we received it today, the land of Israel, as if this was my first day in the land of Israel. Interesting. These two commandments have that special obligation of freshness. Next, both these commandments, it is written in our sages that even if the Torah was to be found in the heavens, we would have to take a ladder and at least try to go up that ladder. What was that song called? Stairway to Heaven by, I think it was Pink Floyd. Yeah, in the Stairway to Heaven, you would still have to make an effort to go up that ladder to the heavens to receive the Torah and to acquire the Torah. The same expression is used that when the Jewish people were in the desert, that even if it took going up a ladder towards the heavens in order to enter the land of Israel, that's an obligation to be done. That effort has to be made. Both the Torah and Eretz Yisrael, ladders, and making a tremendous, it's kind of like dangerous, you're going up there, up that ladder. That's what you have to do. Okay, number 5. Both commandments, the Jewish people were coerced, as we mentioned at the beginning of our class. 6, both commandments were given on Shabbat. We know that in the Talmud tells us, even though there's a dispute on what date the Torah is given, the 6th or the 7th, there is no dispute that that day happened to be the Sabbath. And so too with the land of Israel. The land of Israel was conquered on the first place to be conquered in the land of Israel was Jericho on the 28th day of the month of Nisan. It was conquered on Sabbath. Land of Israel conquered, the first conquest of the land of Israel, first liberation, and the receiving of the Torah, both on Shabbos, on the Sabbath. 7 similarity. When the Jewish people, 40 days after they received the Torah on Mount Sinai, when we worshiped the golden calf, we were punished. And now, instead of being able to retain our Torah studies, and instead of being able to digest very easily the words of Torah, now it would be a tremendous fight and struggle. You know, people, there's a joke that if you're tired and you're having trouble sleeping, so take a holy book, put it into your hands, lie down, and in 3 seconds, you're out like a baby. You know? How does that work? That's another class in itself. How come we get tired when it comes to learning Torah? All of a sudden, you know, when we go to Disneyland or Magic Mountain, we ain't falling asleep. But that's a different class. Okay, so now it's going to be tough. Now we're going to really have to fight. It says about the Gra, the famous Rabbi Eliyahu of Vilna, when he got tired, he would step in ice cubes in order to wake himself up so he wouldn't fall asleep. Also with the land of Israel. It says in our sages, in the tractate of Nidarim, page 32. It says that if the Jewish people would not have fallen and listened to the spies not to come into the land of Israel, the 10 spies, then there would have been no need for warfare in the land of Israel. We would have walked in, the white flags, all of the nations, the 6 nations there, would have lifted that surrender flag, and that's all, folks. It would have been all over. But we listened to the 10 spies. We did not want to enter the land of Israel. So now it would have to be conquered via army, force, Jews falling. So both of them, when we messed up at the beginning stage, the beginning when we received the Torah, the calf, 40 days later, the spies, and then entering the land of Israel. And last but not least, the Beit Yishai finishes and says the following. Who were the 2 arch enemies of Torah and the land of Israel? Torah, the arch enemy to Moshe Rabbeinu, was Korach, of course. Korach said that all of the Jewish people are holy. We don't need leaders. We don't need sages. Rabbi Kook says in his writings that this was the beginning of Christianity. Korach is the beginning roots of Christianity. As we know, the dirty word in the false testament of the Christians is the Pharisees, the Prushim. That would be a dirty word. The rabbis were a dirty word in the Christian writings. Okay, now who were the arch enemies of the Jewish people in the land of Israel? The Canaanites. Both were wiped out. Those that stand in the way of these 2 commandments, Torah and the land of Israel, eventually, if not today, tomorrow. Not tomorrow, the next day. Next week, next year, 10, 100, but it's coming. They were punished. Okay. Next. Which leg is more important? How many times have you been asked that question? I don't know if you can see me now, but I'm standing on one leg. Can't see me, trust me, standing on one leg. Now I'm standing on one leg also, first the right, then the left. How many times? Okay, Yehuda, what's more important? Torah or the land of Israel? The rabbi's answer, Rabbi Kahana's answer would always be, both of them are crippled. Because if you're standing on one leg, the Torah leg, or if you're standing only on the land of Israel leg, in the end of the day, you're handicapped. You're a cripple. So who's to say what's more important? Listen to the answer of Rabbi Yaakov from Emden. Rav Yaakov Emden, page 13, in his prayer book called the Beit Yaakov. Listen to this. Israel, the people, are God's inheritance. The land of Israel is also called God's inheritance. Okay? The Jewish people and the land of Israel are both called the inheritance of God. The Torah is dependent on both of them. The Torah is dependent on the people of Israel and the land of Israel. One that abandons one of these legs abandons the other one as well. An amazing line. One of these grand slams by Rabbi Yaakov Emden. One that leaves the land of Israel has left the leg of Torah. You thought that by leaving the land of Israel you would stand on the leg of Torah? You do not have any legs. One that leaves, okay, one that leaves the land of Israel for Torah, and one that leaves the Torah out of the land of Israel is missing both. So Torah outside the land of Israel is a no-go, no starter, and in Israel without the Torah it's also a no start. You leave one leg, you've left the other. So who's to say which leg is more important? That is the conclusion of Rabbi Emden. And Rabbi Emden actually concludes with this, that it says in Genesis 17:8 that if God says to Abraham, if the Jewish people come into the land of Israel, then they have a God. And if they do not come into the land of Israel, they do not have a God. Amazing. Part 3. Torah needs the land of Israel. Torah's place is in the land of Israel. Let's look how that is. Our first source. Torah needs the land of Israel. We're so used to hearing the opposite, that without Torah, the land of Israel is nothing. Here, we will see opinions that show us the opposite, that the Torah is in need of the land of Israel. Number 1, Rabbeinu Bachya, Deuteronomy 11:18. It says in the Kriyat Shema that even though God might disperse us, exile us from the land of Israel, the next verses talk about the mitzvah of putting on the tefillin phylacteries and the mitzvah of the mezuzah, the scroll, at the person's door. So our sages asked, what's the connection between the Jewish people being tossed out of the land of Israel and these commandments of tefillin, phylacteries, and the commandment of the scroll at the parchment at one's door? So the sages tell us that even though the Jewish people will be thrown out of the land of Israel if they sin, they still must practice the commandments so they do not forget them when they return. Listen to the language of our sages. This is brought in the Sifri. Sifri was by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who he recently, a couple of days ago, celebrated the 33rd day of the Omer. Our sages are telling us a wild thing, that the place to observe, the natural place to observe commandments, is in the land of Israel. The reason why we perform commandments outside the land of Israel is only not to forget them, but their place, the Torah, the commandments, their place in the land of Israel. So, Rabbeinu Bachya, after he brings down what I just mentioned in the Sifri, he says this comes to teach us. Our sages have come to teach us an amazing lesson. That the real place to perform commandments are only in the land of Israel. That is real. Remember the not ready for primetime players? That's doing commandments outside the land of Israel. Not ready for primetime players. Okay, next, the Nachmanides. He writes in many places, I'll just give two. Leviticus 18:25, Genesis 26:5. Nachmanides writes, the Ramban, the commandments were intended to be fulfilled in the land of Israel. 2. God is called the Lord of the land. God's name is on the land of Israel. The Lord of the land. 3. The Gra writes in Shira Shirim, 1st chapter, 4th verse, he writes there, in Aderet Eliyahu is the name of the Gra's book. Ikar HaTorah hi be'eretz Yisrael. The real place of the Torah is in the land of Israel. If you're Torahing it somewhere else, you're not in the right place. The place of Torah, the Gra tells us, this is the place of Torah. And in another place, the Gra tells us, Aderet Eliyahu. Actually, it's the same verse. No, excuse me. Here it is in Deuteronomy 1:5. My mistake. Okay, so this is our second source of Rabbi Eliyahu of Vilna. So he tells us that the revelation of the Torah is in the land of Israel. The revelation of the Torah. When you're learning Torah or observing Torah outside the land of Israel, it's a blind Torah. It's not revealed. Imagine you have a present and it's in a box. Very good. As long as it's in the box, I'm not really enjoying myself. I mean, I know it's in the box, so I do have a little bit of an enjoyment. But I can't get this box open. It's stuck. The land of Israel is the taking off, the revealing of the Torah here in the land of Israel. That is why greats, like Rabbi Dessler said, what took me years to understand, to reveal outside the land of Israel, took me 2 weeks in the land of Israel. The revelation of the Torah here in the land of Israel. The Gra's words. Maimonides, Positive Commandment 153. He says an amazing line in this commandment. It's commandments of sanctifying the new month via the moon. That if the Jews residing in the land of Israel would disappear from the land of Israel, God forbid, he writes, we would not be able to have Jewish holidays. Amazing. The Torah would be null and void if there was not a Jewish settlement in the land of Israel. The Chatam Sofer expands this even further. Listen to his language. This is Chatam Sofer in the Yoredea 234. He says the following: if there remains no Jew in the land of Israel, even simple farmers, simpletons, if there does not remain a Jewish population in the land of Israel, this is Kilyon Ha'umah, the destruction of the Jewish nation, the annihilation of the Jewish nation. Sorry that rhymed. Amazing Chatam Sofer. Think about it. We spoke about the land of the Torah likened to one's breath, to one's heart. It's not subject to our choice. It's either breathe or die. So the Torah, the land of Israel, it's not subject to our choice. It's a matter of life and death. And we see here that if there would not be a Jewish presence in the land of Israel, this would be the annihilation of the Jewish people. So could we understand now why there was a need to coerce? Not because the Jewish people would not accept. The Jewish people would accept. It was to teach us a tremendous lesson of the compulsory, the essential need, the mandatory value of Torah and the land of Israel. Talmud, going on. Next, the Talmud tells us in Tractate Chagiga, page 5, side B, that when the Jewish people were exiled from the land of Israel, there is no greater bitul Torah, wasting of Torah, elimination, levatel, wasting, eliminating Torah. When the Jewish people leave the land of Israel, are expelled, it's not only that we're not in the land of Israel, but the Torah itself has taken a 1-2 TKO punch. There is no greater bitul Torah, elimination of the Torah. The Sifri, once again, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, at the beginning of the portion Akev in the book of Deuteronomy, says, based on the verse of Lamentations 1:9, it says there that amongst the Gentiles there is no Torah. And to this, the Sifri, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, tells us, from this we learn that the Torah is in the land of Israel. The verse in Lamentations tells us, amongst the nations, you might think you have Torah. You might think you're learning Torah. But it's a pale skeleton of the real, revealed Torah. So, an amazing statement. Mikan she'atorah be'eretz Yisrael. The Torah is only in the land of Israel, because amongst the nations there really is no true Torah, deep Torah. Further, second here. There we go. Sorry for that delay. Okay. The Kuzari writes that the land of Israel is the place of Torah. Sounds familiar? Exactly like the words of the Sifrei, just backwards. The land of Israel is the place of Torah. Okay, so we had about 6 or 7 different opinions over there about connection of the Torah and the commandments, the place being the land of Israel, place of Torah, place of commandments, really is only in the land of Israel. Okay, part 4 of our journey. The Torah was given, the Torah and the land of Israel was given to us to separate and elevate us from the nations of the world and from their culture of the nations of the world. Okay, this is brought down by the Be'er Moshe, the famous Rav Moshe Epstein, the Rebbe of Ozorov. He writes this on page 59 on the book of Joshua. The purpose of the Torah was to separate and elevate the people of Israel from the other nations, and so too the land of Israel was to separate and elevate us from the world. So, once again, these two historical events, coercion at Sinai, coercion in the Jordan River. Why? Because Judaism stands or falls on the leg of separation, elevation. It's not to separate, to forget. It's to elevate ourselves. We don't forget the world. We pray for the world. But in order for us to do our job, we first have to separate and elevate ourselves. Once we've done our job, then it's a whole different ballgame. But in this world, that's our job. And who benefits from that? The entire world, not just the Jewish people. That's why it says in many places, if the nations of the world understood what the temple in Jerusalem does for them, they would put soldiers 24/7 to protect that. If the nations of the world understood what the Torah and the land of Israel mean for not only the Jewish people, but for them, they would put soldiers and tanks and airplanes to protect the land of Israel and the Torah for their benefit. Okay. Last but not least for today, let's go back to one of our first earlier sources, Shochar Tov, chapter 68, paragraph 9. We talked about where did the Mount Sinai come from? It came from as if God tore a piece of Mount Moriah where Isaac was binded and almost sacrificed. Those are the words of the Shochar Tov. And he placed it in the desert for the Jewish people to receive the Torah and called it Mount Sinai. Why does the Torah, why do our sages throw in the extra additional words of the binding of Isaac? Just tell me that God took the top of Mount Moriah. I understand Mount Moriah, the temple, sacrifices. I got it. What is this detail There were a lot of things that happened on Mount Moriah. That is where Adam and Eve brought their first sacrifice. Where Noah, after he exited the ark, that's where he brought his sacrifice to. There's a lot of events. What's the big deal? Isaac. Folks are beautiful. Think about this. Isaac was binded. His hands and legs could not move. Hands and legs. What does that mean? The sages are telling us a beautiful lesson here. Mount Moriah represents Isaac. Isaac represents sacrificing himself. Sacrifice, self-sacrifice. It represents coercion. When my hands and feet are tied, I have no free choice here. Whatever my subjugators want to do with me, they could do. So here, we receive a hint that there was a need for coercion. The same idea of Isaac being binded. His hands and legs, he can't do anything. He's immobile. That is exactly the idea of Mount Sinai, and that's the exact idea of Israel, the land of Israel, Mount Moriah. Both, if we want to attain, if we want to acquire Torah and the land of Israel, we have to remember Mount Sinai is Mount Moriah. Mount Moriah is the binding of Isaac. It represents self-sacrifice, the willingness to give our lives, just like Isaac was willing to give his life. He knew where he was heading to. And Abraham was willing to sacrifice his only son, which he waited 100 years for. That is the idea here. When God picked up, so to speak, Mount Sinai and put it above our heads, when God picked up, so to speak, the waters of the Jordan River and put it above our heads, what's the message? God knew that we wanted to come into the land of Israel. God knew that we wanted the Torah. No. God knew that. God wanted to teach us this important lesson. That in order to acquire these two commandments, Torah and the land of Israel, there is a need to be willing to sacrifice one's lives. That's why we were threatened, so to speak. If we're willing to put ourselves in danger for the land of Israel and for the Torah. Wishing everybody a meaningful and special Shavuot holiday. Hope to be here next week.